Maybe you still remember the sound of paws around the house. Not anyway, but that specific sound, rhythm, family, as if it was already part of your life before you even realized it. Now go back a little. Come back that day, the day you saw him for the first time. It could have been in a shelter, on the street, or even in a simple photo. But there was something strange there, something you might not have been able to explain at the time, because it didn't feel like just a date. It felt like recognition, and maybe, just maybe, you are here today because you feel this way even now. This video is for those of you who have ever asked yourself, even if silently, why did he come to me? Here, you will understand something that almost no one talks about. You will start to notice signs that previously seemed small, but perhaps they show that this bond was never common. And more than that, if you've ever lost your dog, this video may give you something you haven't been able to find until today, a new meaning for absence, and a different way of looking at longing. Because sometimes, pain doesn't just come from loss. It comes from the feeling that something remains unexplained. But what if it didn't? What if it all made sense, but you still haven't figured it out? Maybe you already felt this when he looked at you for the first time. That look that wasn't curious. I wasn't scared. It was too calm, as if he already knew who you were, as if he doesn't know you, but finding you again. And this is where everything starts to change, because most people believe they chose their dog. But there is a feeling that does not fit this idea, that strange feeling that, somehow, he was already waiting for you. And maybe you remember the way he followed you right from the beginning, without hesitating. No need for time, as if that house was already his, as if you had been part of his world for much longer. Now let me ask you something. Did you also feel like he trusted you too quickly? Like he already knew you? Because this happens to more people than you might think, and almost no one talks about it. But throughout this video, you'll start to notice patterns, small details that seem normal, but when you put it all together, tell another story. A story that doesn't start on the day you adopted him, but long before that. And perhaps strangest of all, it's just that some people only realize this after they're gone, when the house is silent, when the place where he slept seems too empty, when you can almost hear the sound of paws, even though I know there's no one there. And that's when the question changes. No longer, why did I choose him? But yes, why did he choose me? Now pay attention to this, because what you will understand from now on can completely change the way you see this relationship. And maybe it will also change the way you deal with absence. But before continuing, there is a detail that almost everyone ignores, and it is exactly him who can explain everything. There are things that, at the time, you didn't even give much importance to. They seemed just part of the routine. But today, when you remember calmly, they start to look strange. Not scary strange. Strange to make too much sense. As if small details were trying to tell you something. From the beginning. Maybe you remember how he seemed to know when you were coming. It didn't matter if you took longer or less. Somehow, he was always there, at the door, waiting, even before the sound of the key, before the gate, before any signal, as if he wasn't reacting to the sound, but to you. And that is not as common as it seems. A lot of people think it's a coincidence, routine, instinct. But anyone who lived through this knows there was something different, because it wasn't just waiting. It was the way he expected, anxious, but safe, like someone who has no doubt that you will return. And maybe, at that moment, you didn't even think much about it. But now, remember how you felt when you saw him there? That feeling of belonging, as if, no matter what was going on outside, that place was still yours, because he was there, and there's more. Maybe you also remember how he followed you around the house, not in a sticky way, but constant, silent. You got up, he got up. You would change rooms, and shortly after he would appear, without making any noise, without attracting attention, just being, as if his presence wasn't about watching, but about following up. And that changes everything, because it doesn't look like the behavior of an animal that is just adapting. He looks like someone who already knows his rhythm, who already understands your movements, who already recognizes you. Now think about something else, that specific place in the house, the place where he liked to lie down. It could be a corner of the living room, near the sofa, or even that space where there was a little sun. Maybe at the time you thought it was just preference. But today, this El Uger looks different. It looks loaded. Because it wasn't just a physical place, it was as if that was the point where he connected with you, where he watched you in silence, without asking for anything, without interrupting, just being close. And maybe that's exactly why this place was so hard to ignore after he left, because he wasn't the only one who left. It was the presence. And then comes something that almost no one can explain properly: the look. If you've ever had a dog, you know. It's not an ordinary look. It's not just affection. It's not just attention. It's something deeper. As if, for a few seconds, he saw beyond what you showed, in addition to what you said, as if he understood things you couldn't even put into words. And this usually happens at specific moments. When you are sad, tired, lost, he doesn't do anything much. It doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't change the situation. But he stays there. And somehow, this changes everything, as if his presence was enough. Now take a second and think about it calmly. What if these moments weren't just coincidence? What if each of these attitudes was a way for him to get closer to you, because he already knew who you were? Because when you put it all together, the way he expected you, the way he followed you, the way he looked at you, it no longer seems random. It seems intentional. And there is something that many people only realize later. These behaviors do not diminish over time. They hold their own, as if they were not the result of adaptation, but something that was there from the beginning. And maybe that's why, even after they're gone, those memories are still so vivid. Not like ordinary souvenirs, but as pieces of something bigger, something you're still trying to understand. Now pay attention to this, because there is a story that can make all of this take on a new meaning. A true story of someone who went through exactly that, and he only realized it too late. That had never been a coincidence. There was a person who commented on something that, at first glance, seemed simple. But when you listen carefully, it completely changes the way you see everything. She said she was never the type to believe in such things. For her, dogs were company. Love, yes, but within what could be explained. Until the day she entered that shelter. She didn't even want to adopt. It was just a matter of accompanying a friend, without intention, no expectations, just another ordinary day. But then, something happened that she could never forget. In the midst of so many dogs, noise, movement, there was one that didn't bark. It didn't jump. He wasn't trying to attract attention. He just looked. And when she walked in front of him, he didn't react like the others. He didn't stir. He didn't move away. He just kept looking, fixed, calm, as if he had been waiting for exactly that moment. She said that, at the time, she felt something strange. It wasn't pity. It wasn't an impulse. It was familiarity. As if that scene had already happened before. As if that look had already crossed hers at some other time. And yet, she left. Tried to ignore it. She told herself it didn't make sense. But that night, Something wouldn't leave her alone. She said that when she lay down, she had an uncomfortable feeling, as if he had left someone waiting, not an animal, somebody. And the next day, she came back. Without notifying anyone, without planning, it just came back, and when he got there, among many other dogs, he was in the same place, in the same position, and when he saw her, it was no surprise. It was like confirmation, as if he already knew she would return. And it was at that moment that everything changed, because she said she didn't feel like she was choosing. He felt like he was accepting something that had already been decided. After that came the details, those that, at the time, seemed small, but today, they make much more sense. He knew when she arrived, even without a routine, he would go to the door before any noise, and it stayed there, waiting. And it wasn't ordinary anxiety, it was certainty. And inside the house, it was the same thing. He followed her, but not in a dependent way. It was as if he was tagging along, as someone who doesn't want to lose sight of the other, but not out of fear, by bond. And there was a specific day that she never forgot, a difficult day. She was sitting on the floor, no energy, no desire to talk to anyone. And he approached slowly. He sat in front of her. And he looked, no barking, without touching, just looking. She said that look, didn't ask for anything. I didn't judge. I didn't try to solve it, but somehow, it said it all, as if he knew exactly what she was feeling. And at that moment, she had a certainty that she couldn't explain, the certainty that he already knew her. Now think about it calmly, because maybe, on some level, you've experienced something similar. Maybe not the same, but close. That moment when you realize that your dog doesn't react to you like a stranger, but as someone who is already part of his story. And that moves with something deep, because it breaks logic, but it makes emotional sense. Now let me ask you a question. Have you ever had the feeling that, in the middle of so many possible paths, he ended up exactly with you, as if it weren't by chance? Because when you start looking at these stories, they are not isolated. They repeat themselves, with different people, in different places, but with the same pattern, the same kind of look, the same type of behavior, the same feeling that is difficult to explain. And this raises something that many people avoid thinking about. Maybe it wasn't a common choice. Maybe it was a reunion. And if that's true, so everything that seemed small begins to gain new weight. But there is still a part of this story that is deeper. Because it's not just about how it got to you. It's about what he seemed to know, before you even realized it. And that's exactly what starts to bother me. Because if he knew, so maybe this has never been random. There is a part of this relationship that almost no one can explain logically, because it's not in what he did, it's in what he perceived. And maybe you've never stopped to look at it in depth. But your dog knew things about you that no one else did, not because someone told you, not because he learned over time, but because he just felt it. And this begins to appear in the quietest moments, those days when you didn't say anything to anyone, but inside, it was heavy, tired, confused, and yet, he came, without you calling, without you looking. No clear signal, he just showed up. And it was close. Sometimes it pulled over. Sometimes I just lay there, in the same room, but always at the right time. As if he had access to a part of you that even you didn't quite understand, and maybe you remember that now. From a specific day. One of those days when everything seemed out of place. You didn't want to talk. I didn't want to explain. I just wanted to be quiet. And somehow, he realized. Speechless. No explanation. Just noticed. And this doesn't happen by chance. Because perceiving human emotion with such precision, it goes beyond instinct. It's connection. Now think calmly. How many times did he show up exactly when you needed him? No delay, no error. As if he was in sync with you. And this becomes even more evident in extreme moments. When something goes wrong. When you receive difficult news. When you feel alone, even when surrounded by people. It's in these moments that he doesn't fail. It doesn't disappear. He doesn't get distracted. It remains. And that says a lot. Why stay when no one else notices? It's not random behavior. It's choice. Now there's something even deeper, and few people talk about it. The moments when he seemed to predict you. Before you got up, he was already paying attention. Before you left, he was already near the door. Before you changed your mood, he had already changed his behavior. As if he was one step ahead, as if he wasn't reacting, but anticipating. And this starts to affect something bigger, because anticipating requires connection, requires reading, it requires knowledge. Now remember that look, that silent look, no urgency, no expectations, just presence. Have you ever noticed that sometimes it seemed like he was watching you, not out of curiosity, but for recognition? As if, in that moment, he was seeing beyond the person you showed him. And this happens more than we admit, especially when you are most vulnerable, more real, but you. And maybe that's why this look sticks out, because it's not just a memory, it's a sensation. Now let me bring you something that might bother you a little, but it can also make everything fall into place. What if he wasn't learning about you, but just remembering who you are, remembering how you feel, remembering something that already existed before that meeting? Because that would explain a lot. It would explain why trust came quickly. Because the connection took no effort. Because the silence between you has never been uncomfortable. And why, even without words, you understood each other. Now think about another scene, the quiet house, you in a corner, and he in his usual place. That place where he liked to stay, observing, gift, and even without doing anything, he changed the environment. The climate changed. It changed you. This is not small. This is active emotional presence. And you can't build this from nothing. Now hold that idea, because it changes everything. Maybe he didn't come into your life to get to know you. Maybe he already knew exactly what he was getting into, and exactly who you were. Now let me ask you a question. If he seemed to understand you in moments when you didn't even understand yourself, what does that say about the connection between you? Because when you start looking at it from that angle, the relationship is no longer simple, it is no longer explainable, and it starts to gain depth. It seems, planned. And this opens a door that many people avoid crossing. But when you cross, you can't go back anymore. Because everything changes place. Everything takes on another meaning. And it is exactly at this point that a sentence begins to emerge, a phrase that can dismantle everything you believed until today, and at the same time, explain everything. There's a moment when everything starts to fall into place in a way you didn't expect. It's not proof. It's not something someone teaches you. It's a perception. She arrives slowly, but when it arrives, it changes everything. Because after that, you can no longer look at this relationship in the same way. And maybe you're already starting to feel that now. After remembering so many details, so many moments, so many coincidences that, deep down, they no longer seem like coincidences. This is where a simple but powerful idea emerges. An idea that bothers you at first, but when you accept it, it brings a different kind of peace. The idea is this: you didn't choose your dog. You were recognized by him. And when that phrase really comes into play, everything changes place. Because choosing is something rational. It's comparing. It's deciding. But recognize, it's instantaneous. It doesn't need an explanation. It doesn't need time. It's something that happens before logic. And maybe that's exactly what you felt on that first date. It was not an ordinary decision. It was something faster, deeper, more right than it should be. Now think about it calmly. If it was just a choice, why did it seem so hard to ignore? Why, even when you tried to move on, something pulling you back? Why did that look stick in your head? Why didn't that feeling go away? Because recognition doesn't go away easily. It remains, even when we try to rationalize. And that explains something that a lot of people feel, but don't understand. That feeling that the right dog appears at the right time. Not before, not later. Exactly when you need it, even if you don't know it yet. And this is not about superficial need, it's about something deeper. Times when you are most vulnerable, more open, more human. That's where he appears. And not as a coincidence, but as an answer. Now hold this, because this part is important. If he recognized you, so somehow, you were already important to him, before you even knew who he was. And this completely changes the logic of the relationship, because it stops being about possession. It stops being about adoption, and it becomes about bonding. A bond that didn't start that day, just continued. Now this can generate an internal conflict, because it affects everything we learned. The starting idea, the idea of first time. But what if it wasn't the first? What if it was just the continuation of something you don't remember? Because that would explain the kind of connection you had. It would explain why the silence was comfortable. Because his presence was enough. Because you didn't need to make an effort to be understood. Now go back to that opening scene, the first date, the look, the feeling. Nothing there seemed neutral. Everything seemed loaded with meaning, even if you didn't know which one. And this doesn't happen with any relationship. It doesn't happen to just any animal. It happens when there is something previous, something that doesn't need to be built from scratch. Now let me bring you a simple image. Two people who meet after a long time. They don't start from scratch. There is an ease, a quick intimacy, a connection that does not need to be explained. With your dog, it was like that. And maybe that's why everything was so natural, so immediate, so right. But here is the point that most affects everything. If he recognized you, so he knew. I knew who you were. I knew how you felt. I knew what he was getting into. And this completely changes the way you see his every behavior. Nothing was random. Nothing was just instinct. Everything had direction. Everything had intention. Now let me ask you a question. If he didn't come into your life by chance, then why do you believe that your story would simply end with his physical absence? Because that's the next layer. And it is even deeper. But before getting there is something you need to consider. And that can be uncomfortable at first, but then turns into something you won't want to ignore. Because when you understand this, loss is no longer just loss, and it starts to transform into something else, something that is not over yet, and that's exactly it, which is starting to appear now. Now. Breathe a little and stay with me here. Because what comes now is not about proving anything. It's about feeling if it makes sense within you. Effortless, no obligation, just understand. What if that meeting wasn't the beginning? What if it was just the moment when two stories intersected again? This may seem abstract at first, but when you bring it to actual memories, things start to fall into place in a different way. Remember how fast everything went? The trust, the proximity, the absence of fear. He didn't study you for long. He didn't need weeks to adapt. It was almost immediate, as if he wasn't meeting a stranger, but meeting someone who was already part of his world. And that completely changes the way you interpret that beginning. Because it wasn't construction, it was continuity. Now back to the small details, the way he fit into your routine, as if he already knew where to stay, where to lie down, where to find you, without anyone teaching, no repetition, no trial and error. This doesn't seem like ordinary learning. It seems memory. And maybe that's why, even with time passing, the connection did not decrease. She went deeper, like something that already had roots, something that didn't need to be created from scratch. Now think about something else. The difficult times. The ones where you were most vulnerable, quieter, more lost. He was not only present, he seemed to understand, without you explaining, without you demonstrating clearly. And this creates an inevitable question. How does someone understand so well something that has never been taught? The simplest answer would be sensitivity, but maybe there is something beyond that, something that is not learned, something that is already ready. Now let me bring you an image. Imagine two long paths that cross several times, at different times, in different phases, but always with the same essence, the same two presences, meeting again and again and again. And if this time, this meeting took place in the way you know it, a human and a dog, but the bond didn't start there. It just changed shape. Now hold that sentence, because it can change the way you feel absence. Some connections are not born. They continue. And that explains something that a lot of people feel, but can't put into words. The intensity. Because it was not proportional to time. There were people who had lived with a dog for years and didn't feel what you felt. And that always seemed strange. But maybe it isn't. Maybe it's because the bond wasn't new. Maybe it existed before and only came back to the surface. Now go back to that feeling. The one you had at the beginning. The familiarity, quick comfort, effortless confidence. None of this matches something newly created. It matches something recognized. And this is where a lot of things start to make sense, including the after, mainly after, because when he was gone, it wasn't just the physical absence that hurt. It was the breaking of something that seemed permanent, as if it shouldn't end there. And maybe it's not over. Maybe it just changed shape again, because if the bond didn't start in that life, why would it end there? Now let me ask you a question. If you feel like he is still present in some way, even without being physically there, do you think this is just longing? Or could it be something that continues to exist? Because that feeling of formless presence, it's more common than it seems. It's in the silence of the house, in the place where he used to stay, in the sound that you almost hear, but can't explain. As if, for a moment, he was still there. And maybe this isn't just memory. Maybe it's continuity. Now pay attention to this, because this is where everything connects to something bigger. If he recognized you, if he already seemed to know you, if the connection didn't feel new, so maybe this bond is not tied to a single existence, and this does not need to be seen as something distant or impossible. It can be seen as something simple, a connection that does not only depend on the physical to exist, a connection that goes through phases, moments, and maybe more than one life. And when you start to accept that possibility, the pain changes place. It doesn't disappear, but she transforms. It ceases to be the end, and it starts to feel like an interval. And that doesn't lessen the love, increase, because it takes away a limited amount of time and puts it into something bigger, something continuous. Now hold this, because what comes next will bring everything to a close. It will come back exactly to that first moment, but this time with a meaning you didn't have before. And that's when everything really changes. Now come back with me, once again. Go back to that sound, the sound of paws around the house, that light, familiar, almost predictable rhythm. For a while, it was just part of your day, something so common that you didn't even realize how important it was until the day it stopped. And silence took place, an awkward silence, heavy, as if the house had lost something that couldn't be replaced. And maybe it was at that moment that everything really started to hurt, not just because of the physical absence, but for the feeling that something was incomplete, no response, no explanation. But now, after everything you remembered, of everything you felt throughout this video, maybe this silence will begin to have another meaning. Because that sound, maybe it was never just physical presence. Maybe it was a sign of something that was there, far beyond what you could see. And when you look at it from that angle, silence stops being empty, and it starts to feel like pause. Now think about it calmly. If he recognized you, if he already seemed to know you, if the connection between you never needed to be built from scratch, so maybe the bond isn't limited to what you saw. Maybe he will continue. Otherwise, on another level. But keep going. And this isn't about denying the longing. She continues. Emptiness, too. The place where he slept still looks different. The house still carries something that has not returned to normal. And this is all real. All of this matters. But now there is a new layer, a new way of looking, because maybe what you called the end, it wasn't a real end. Maybe it was just a change. Now let me bring you a simple image. Someone leaves a room. You don't see that person anymore. But that doesn't mean it ceased to exist. She's just not in the same space anymore. And maybe it's like that with him. He is no longer visible, but that doesn't mean total absence. Because the bond, the one you felt from the first look, it doesn't just depend on what is physical. It remains in the memories, in sensations, in the way you still remember it, in detail, and mainly in the way you still feel. Now pay attention to this, because it might be the most important part of all. The love you feel for him didn't come out of nowhere. And if it didn't come out of nowhere, maybe it won't disappear over time either. It changes, it transforms, but it doesn't disappear. And that completely changes the way you carry this story, because you stop carrying it as a loss and starts loading as continuity, like something that is still part of you. Now let me invite you. It's not a request, it's a recognition. If you felt at some point that your dog didn't come into your life by chance, comment here. He found me. This is not just a comment. It is a way of recognizing this bond, to give a name to something you've always felt, but perhaps never explained. And if you've already noticed signs, little moments, sensations that don't just seem like longing, counts too. Because when you share this, you realize you are not alone, that there are other people who felt exactly the same. And that creates something bigger, a type of connection that goes beyond individual history. Now, before I close, stay with this. Maybe that first look wasn't the beginning. Maybe it was a reunion. And maybe this silence you feel today, not be absence, just be the space between a date and the next. Because some connections, they don't end. They just wait for the right moment to happen again. Now that everything has been said, there is something that perhaps you are feeling in silence. It's not just emotion, it's recognition. As if, deep down, you already knew all this. I just hadn't put it into words yet. Because when we look back and start connecting the dots, it is no longer possible to see this story as something common. It can no longer be called a coincidence. And most importantly, I can no longer believe it was just a dog. Because it wasn't. It never was. It was presence. It was real company. It was someone who walked with you, even when no one else noticed. And that leaves marks. But not just pain marks. Meaning marks. Now think about how you got here. Everything you lived with him. The simple moments, ordinary days, the little scenes that, at the time, seemed normal, but today they are the most important. The sound of pause, the way he expected you, the place where he slept, the silence afterwards. None of this is small. None of this is forgettable, because all of this built something inside you, something that is still there. Now let me show you something that many people only realize too late. The bond does not live in physical presence. It lives in the way it changed you, in the way you started to feel, in the way you started to see the world after him. And it doesn't go away. Now hold that idea, because it closes everything. If he chose you, if he recognized you, if he came into your life at the right time. So he accomplished something that perhaps not even you fully understand. But somehow, it transformed you. And when there is transformation, there is continuity, because what changes you, it can't just end. Now come back for the last time in that first memory, the first look, that strange feeling of familiarity. If before you saw it as chance, now maybe I see it as a sign, like a reunion point, like the beginning of something that was already underway. And that changes the weight of everything, including longing, because longing is no longer just pain and becomes proof. Proof that it was real. Proof that it was profound. Proof that it still exists within you. Now let me ask you the last question. If this bond changed who you are, do you really believe it can? Simply cease to exist? Because when you answer that honestly, something inside you calms down. Not because the pain goes away, but because it makes sense. And when the pain has felt, it stops being just a loss. It becomes connection. Now, if this video touched something real in you, makes one last simple movement. Write in the comments, "We are still connected." Not for me, but for you, to mark this understanding, to recognize this bond, and to find other people who also felt this way. Because when these stories meet, they form something bigger, a kind of silent community where no one needs to explain much, because everyone has felt it. And maybe that's exactly it, that he always wanted to show you. May the love you lived, I wasn't tied to time, not even the body, not for a single moment, but something bigger, something that continues, something that remains, something that always finds its way back.